We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf and Beis Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 26b. Rava asks Rav Nachman the following question: Ezu hi shigagas Shevuos bitoy l'shavar. How do you come up with a case of Shevuos bitoy, which is made in the past tense, which is a shogeg? Again, the Gemara said earlier in the previous Amud that if it's by accident, if it's an onus, there is no carbon. It has to be specifically shogeg. And so essentially the question is, what's considered shogeg? When is it not an onus, rather considered shogeg? And the Gemara continues and explains the question. Yada, if the person knows that what he's saying is actually false, again, this is a past tense Shavuos, so he's saying something that happened already, but he's saying the opposite of what actually happened. So if he knows that he's swearing falsely, so mezidu, so then it's a situation of on purpose. And he deloyad, if he has no idea that what he's saying is not true, so onesu, so wouldn't that be considered a case of onus? Rashi explains, Ezu hi shigagas Shevuos bitoy l'sha'avar, kevan de be'inon adam b'Shevuos, since we need the person to be considered an adam, so hechi mashkachas l'shogeg, how do you have that middle ground where it's considered shogeg? Again, if it's an onus, if it's out of the person's control, it's not considered adam. Idi yada b'shas Shevuos shu nishba l'sheker, if he knows at the moment of the oath that he's swearing falsly, so mezidu, that's on purpose, ukrach chasav v'nelam, again it says there has to be a lapse of awareness. And Rashi notes, b'shlama lahaba, now I understand in the future tense, you could have a case as follows. At the time of the Shevuot, he knows what's going on. And then after some time, so then there's a lapse of awareness in terms of the Shevuot. But in terms of a past tense Shevuot, how do you come up with a case? And the Gemara continues and answers. Amar Lei said to him, Ba'omer, the person says as follows: Yodeya anisha Shevuah zu asura. I know that this Shevuah is forbidden. Aval eini yodeya im chayav and olah carbon im olav. I just don't know if there's a liability for a carbon. The fact that he doesn't know about carbon, that puts him in the category of shogeg. The Gemara says, come on, now who is this following? It seems to be Munbaz. It seems to be following the opinion of Munbaz. The Yamar Shigagas Carbon Shmoshgaga. He says in general that when you have a shogeg that you don't know about the carbon, that is called shogeg. And so apparently that's what we're applying over here. And the Gemara says, Afilu Temer Rabbanan. You could actually even say that really it follows the Rabbanan who argue with Munbaz as well. Because Adkan Lo Pligi Rabbanan led to Munbaz. The Rabbanan only argue with Munbaz, Ela B'chol Torah Kula, in the rest of the Torah, the Lav Chidashu, because there it's not a chiddush, it's not a novel idea. Aval hacha, but over here the chidushu, where it's a novel kind of carbon. The bechol Torah kula lo eshkachan lav the maisi carbon, because in everywhere else in the Torah we never find that a negative commandment brings a carbon. A carbon is always associated specifically with something that would have gotten kares if it was done b'mezid. A regular lav, you don't bring a carbon. The alfinan me avodah zarah, that's what we learn out from avodah zarah again, that a regular lav, there's no carbon. It really has to be something that involves kares. Maisi, and over here the person brings a carbon even though it doesn't involve kares. That's why this is a novel situation. So there afilu rabbanan modu. So therefore even the rabbanan would admit that in this case, if the person is not aware of the carbon, that actually would be considered a shogeg. And Rashi explains, the v'chol haTorah lo eshkachan lav the maisi carbon below kares. We don't find that everywhere else in the Torah that you bring a carbon if it doesn't involve kares. It has to involve kares in order to have a carbon. Here that is not true. It's a novel situation, and that's why again it would be considered shogeg if the person is not aware of the carbon. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei Ravina me Rava. Ravina asks Rava the following question: Nishba al kikor. Let's say a person takes an oath with regards to a loaf, he's not going to eat it. Umistachen oleh, but then his life is in danger over it. He needs to eat it, or else he might die. So mahu. So then, what is the halach in such a case? The Gemara says, Mistaken, 1 second, if his life is in danger, so lishri leimar, so then the master should allow it. It certainly should be allowed in such a situation. Rashi explains, Lishri leimar v'kevan diyasa lekamon sharinan lechatchila. Since if he would come in front of us, we would permit it for him lechatchila. Ki achalei behelam shvua, even if he eats it with a lapse of awareness. Let's say he doesn't remember with regards to the shvua. Lo avar al shvua, so certainly that would not be considered a transgression in terms of his shvua. And so the Gemara instead revises the question, ela rather mitzdaer. Let's say the case is that he was mitzdaer, he was very hungry, he was in pain. V'achla b'shigagas shvua, but then when he ate it, he actually did have a lapse of awareness in terms of the shvua. So what would be the halacha in such a case? Rashi explains, mitztar barav, again he's very hungry. V'inami lo nelma mimeno. The point over here is that even if there was no lapse of awareness, haya ochla, he would have eaten it anyhow. V'achla b'shogeg behelam shvua, but it ended up that he ate it behelam shvua. He ate it because of the lapse of awareness, so he ate it b'shogeg. So what's the halacha in that case? The question is, does he bring a carbon or not? Mai, again, what's the halacha? Amar Lei said to him, Tanina, we learned the answer in a brisa. The brisa says, Shavuot mi yediyaso, mevi carbon al shigagaso. If the person, when he would know, he would not do what he did, he would return, so to speak, and he wouldn't do it, so then he brings a carbon because of his mistake. In other words, if it's a situation that had he not had a lapse of awareness, he would not have acted in that fashion, so then he brings a carbon. But lo shav mi yediyaso, let's say it's a situation where he would not have changed just because of the knowledge. Even if he did not have a lapse of awareness, he is still going to eat this because he's in a lot of pain, so then ein mevi carbon al shigagaso, he does not bring a carbon for his shogeg, for his mistake, and so therefore in this case he would not bring a carbon. And the Gemara continues, Amar Shmuel, Shmuel says, Gomar belibo, let's say the person thinks in his heart, he thinks in his mind the shvua, but still tzarech sheyotzi b'svasav, he actually has to say it verbally with his lips, otherwise it is not a shvua, it's not considered a shvuas bitui. Shenemar, it says levate b'svasayim, it says with the lips in the pasuk, that's what it means. The Gemara says, Meisvei, we have a question from the following brisa. It says in the brisa, bisfasayim with the lips, v'lo b'leiv, and not with the heart. Gamar belibo minayin. Now, how do we know that if he decides in his heart that is considered a shvua? Talmud lomer l'chol asher yevate ha'adam b'shvua. It says any way that he expresses it. So even if it's just believe, even if it's just in his heart, that seems to be not like Shmuel is saying. But the Gemara first asks, Hagufa Kasha, but this brisa you're bringing, it's internally contradictory. Because Amrit b'svasayim velobele. First the brisa says, with the lips and not with the heart. V'hadar Amrit, and then you say, Gamar belibo minayin. How do we know that even with the heart it's enough? How do we know even that is considered to be a shvua? So it's a contradiction within the brisa itself. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Sheshes says, Holo Kasha, that's not difficult. In terms of explaining the brisa, we can explain the brisa, because Hachi Kamar, this is what the brisa is saying. Bisvasayim, again, it has to be with the lips. V'lo shegamar belibo lahotzi bisvasav v'lo hotzi. It cannot be a case where he thought in his heart that he's going to say it verbally with his lips, and then he didn't do that. Once he committed to saying it out loud, he has to say it out loud. Now, Gamar belibo stam. Now, what if he's just thinking in his heart? He's just thinking in his mind, and he's never committing to saying it out loud at all. So, minayin, from where do we know that is a shvua? Talmud lomer l'chol asher yevate. The pasuk says l'chol asher yevate. So again, that's still a question for Shmuel, because it doesn't seem to be that you have to verbalize. Ela l'shmuel kasha. Again, according to Shmuel, it is still difficult. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Sheshes says, Taretz ve'em hachi. You can answer. You could say as follows. Here's what the brisa actually means. Bisvasayim has to be with the lips. V'lo shegamar belibo lahotzi paschit, and it can't be that he thinks in his heart, he thinks in his mind that he's going to say wheat. V'hotzi pasor, and then he says barley. That would not be good. Gamar belibo lahotzi paschit. Now, if he thinks in his heart to say paschit and to say wheat bread, v'hotzi pas stam, but then he just says pas, he doesn't identify it as wheat bread. Minayin, from where do we know that that's a good shvua? Talmud lomer l'chol asher yevate ha'adam. That's what we learn from the pasuk when it says l'chol asher yevate ha'adam. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question from the following brisa on Shmuel. Motzes vasecha tishmor v'yasisa talks about, again, what you verbalize with your lips. Ein li ela shehotzi b'svasav, I only know that the person verbalized it with his lips. Gamar belibo minayin, from where do we know that if the person just determined it in his heart, in his mind, that's enough? Talmud lomer, the pasuk says, kol nediv leiv, it says anybody who donates from the heart, and so therefore, again, you see from there that apparently you don't need to verbalize it. That's a question on Shmuel. And the Gemara says to that, Shani Hasim, it's different over there. Dechsiv kol nediv leiv, because there in that context, it says the word kol nediv leiv. Rashi explains, Motzes fasecha gabe noder lahavi karbon ksiv. This pasuk is specifically by a neder, when the person makes an oath to bring a carbon. And so again, since it says over there, by carbon kol nediv leiv, there we understand you don't need to verbalize it. Person doesn't need to actually say it out loud, but that's not a question on Shmuel. Shmuel's talking about a Shavuos bito. He's not talking about a neder of a carbon. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'nigmar mina, but why don't we learn from there? We should learn from this case of carbon that in our case as well, you don't need to verbalize it. And the Gemara says to that, Mishum dahavet truma v'kodshim shnei ksuven haboin ke'echad, because this is not the only source. Truma and kodshim are two psukim that are teaching the same thing. They're both teaching that you don't need to verbalize it. We'll see Rashi in a moment. V'chol shnei ksuven haboin ke'echad. Anytime you have two psukim that are teaching teaching the same thing, ein malamdin. They actually can't teach to another case. If you were going to learn to all cases, you would have just said it in one of the cases, and then we would have said a mamotzinu, just like we find over here. This is the halacha. That's true everywhere else. But the fact that it says it in two places, that's like a limitation. It only applies in these two cases and nowhere else. The Gemara says, Hanichol damar ein malamdin. Well, that works according to the one who says, Shnei ksuvin haboin ke'echad ein malamdin. Ela laman damar malamdin. But according to the one who says that actually you are able to learn from Shnei ksuvin haboin ke'echad, so ma'ikol lememar. So again, what are we going to say? Why not learn from Truma and Kodshim to our case of Shvuah? And the Gemara says to that, have a chulin v'kodshim, but still, the two cases that we have are involve kodshim, and our case of shvuah involves chulin. It's not something that involves kodshim. V'chulin mi kodshim lo gamrin, we cannot learn our chulin from kodshim. And Rashi explains truma v'kodshim. Again, the Gemara said that truma and kodshim are shnei ksuvin haboin ke'echad. What are truma and kodshim? What does that refer to? Rashi says trumas meleches hamishkan. Truma refers to trumas meleches hamishkan, the donations that were made to the mishkan. Ksiv bo, it's written over there, kol nediv leiv heviu. It says kol nediv leiv. The full pasuk over there is vayavo hanoshim al hanoshim kol nediv leiv heviu chach vanezim v'tabas v'chumaz kol kli zav v'chol ish asher hinif tenuvas zav l'Hashem. So the donations to the mishkan, they're nediv leiv. They don't have to be verbalized. V'gabe kodshim, and also by kodshim, by korbanos. Ksiv b'chizkiyo, it's written in Chizkiyo b'sefer divrei hayamim v'chol nediv leiv olos. It says nediv leiv when you're donating a korban, and that's similar to motza svasecha, which was also a neder to bring a korban. It says nediv leiv. Again, it does not need to be verbalized. Again, the full pasuk over there, Vayan Chizkiyo Vayomer Atam Milesim Yedchem LaHashem Goshu V'Haviu Zavachim V'Todos Leveis Hashem, talking about bring karbonos. Vayaviu Hakol Zavachim V'Todos V'Chol Nediv Leiv Olos. So it uses the word Nediv Leiv, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph.